Bosnia became one of the earliest proving grounds for modern counter-terror and high-value target operations.
For nearly 4 years, Bosnia was the battleground for the bloodiest war in Europe since World War II.
One of the most significant undertakings was known as Operation Amber Star. The mission was simple in theory, but incredibly dangerous in practice. Track down and apprehend those responsible for the war's worst atrocities, men like Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. To the outside world, these were ghosts, moving between mountain hideouts and heavily guarded compounds. To Delta operators, they were names, faces, and patterns. Every conversation intercepted, every movement noted, every whisper from a source in a remote village was another piece of the puzzle. Operators spent weeks and months building target packages, blending in with civilian life, sometimes disguised as aid workers, sometimes posing as journalists, sometimes just another foreigner passing through. The risk was constant. A single slip, one wrong move could expose the entire team and bring political chaos. For the operators, Bosnia wasn't a quick in-and-out deployment. Many were stationed for months, even years, rotating between forward operating sites and safe houses across the region. One Delta operator later recalled how they were stuck in Bosnia for years, chasing war criminals and running surveillance missions in conditions that tested even the most experienced veterans. The work was relentless. Surveillance during the day, intelligence meetings at night, planning sessions in dimly lit rooms with maps and satellite imagery scattered across tables. There was no glory, no headlines, just the quiet knowledge that their work was shaping the war in ways the public would never fully understand. One operation in the town of Vlasenica showed the meticulous planning that defined Delta's presence in Bosnia. The mission? Plant a hidden surveillance system near a suspected war criminal's apartment to record every entrance, every visitor, every movement. It wasn't glamorous. Operators spent days preparing, rehearsing every step of the mission using scaled models, down to practicing driving routes and identifying signage in Cyrillic. On the night of the operation, a car equipped with cameras was quietly parked outside the target building. From that single vantage point, they collected days of intelligence that would help build a case strong enough to stand in The Hague. These were the kinds of missions that defined their time in Bosnia: quiet, precise, and absolutely critical. Life in the field meant constant movement. The war-torn roads of Bosnia were dangerous, unpredictable, and always changing. One team described the long drive, sometimes hours each way, just to pass through a target city to collect information or confirm license plates. Every trip was a gamble, mines still lined the countryside, and militias manned unpredictable checkpoints. On one run, an operator discovered an alternate back road, shaving nearly an hour off the route, but adding new risks: isolation, lack of support, and the possibility of an ambush with no quick way out. Bosnia demanded adaptability. Plans changed by the hour. Routes were mapped, erased, and remapped. Every journey was calculated, every contingency considered, because survival depended on it. Delta's work in Bosnia was conducted under the cloak of plausible deniability. These missions were so sensitive that operators carried unmarked weapons, wore civilian clothing, and traveled in vehicles with no identifying marks. If something went wrong, if they were captured or killed, there would be no public acknowledgement, no headlines, no official rescue. This was warfare in its purest shadow form. Quiet professionals executing tasks with surgical precision, knowing the world would never hear their names. What made Delta Force effective in Bosnia was not just their skill, but their experience. These men had already been tested in the jungles of Vietnam, the streets of Panama, and the deserts of the Middle East. They carried lessons from every operation, every success, and every failure. Bosnia forced them to adapt those lessons to a new kind of war, one fought not just on the battlefield, but in the blurred lines between diplomacy, intelligence, and covert action. Every mission was a balance of force and subtlety, aggression and patience. The roads of Bosnia in the mid-1990s were as dangerous as the battlefields themselves. Paved highways were rare outside major cities, and most rural routes were narrow, winding dirt roads carved into the mountains. Bridges had been destroyed by shelling, leaving detours that added hours to even short trips. Mines were a constant threat. Entire stretches of road were marked only by hand-painted skulls on wooden boards, if they were marked at all. Convoys and unmarked vehicles alike risked ambushes from militia checkpoints, where control shifted daily depending on who held the ground. Every journey was a calculation. Operators planned alternate routes, drove at irregular times, and never stayed in one place too long. The roads weren't just a way to move through Bosnia, they were part of the war itself, unpredictable and deadly at every turn. They were the Watchers, the invisible presence in a country tearing itself apart. Moving through the streets of Sarajevo and Tuzla, through mountain roads where danger hid behind every turn, they collected the information no satellite could provide. They weren't there to be heroes, they were there to make sure the right targets were marked, the right decisions made, and the war pushed toward an end. The men of Delta Force didn't write books about Bosnia. They didn't sit for interviews or documentaries. Most of what they did remains locked away in classified reports, redacted pages, and whispers among those who were there, but their impact is undeniable. The intelligence they gathered shaped NATO airstrikes, guided arrests, and helped end one of the most brutal conflicts in modern European history. Bosnia taught them lessons that would carry into future wars. The methods refined in the Balkans would later be used in Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless other places where American special operations would be called upon to fight wars that were never meant to be seen. By late 1994, the world knew the names. Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, the architects of ethnic cleansing, the men behind the sieges, the massacres, the genocide at Srebrenica. But knowing their names wasn't enough. They were ghosts, hidden behind layers of loyal militias, secret routes, and safe houses scattered across the rugged mountains of Bosnia. Arresting them was not just difficult, it was nearly impossible. But in a quiet, windowless room, plans were being drawn for a mission that would change the game. The code name, Operation Amber Star. Amber Star was conceived in response to a growing realization among NATO allies. Airstrikes and diplomatic pressure alone would never stop the war criminals driving the conflict. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia ICTY in The Hague had issued indictments, but there was no mechanism to enforce them on the ground. NATO needed operators, men who could move in silence, build networks of informants, and deliver actionable intelligence to capture the most wanted figures in the region. The responsibility fell on a coalition of elite units, Delta Force, the British SAS, and select elements of NATO allies. Together, they formed a shadow task force designed to hunt some of the most elusive targets in modern warfare. The operational environment in Bosnia was unlike anything Delta had faced before. Unlike a conventional battlefield, Bosnia was a patchwork of shifting control lines, unpredictable allegiances, and hostile militias. One day, a town might be controlled by Bosnian Serb forces, the next by a rogue paramilitary group. The terrain, dense forests, winding mountain passes, bombed-out cities provided endless hiding places. Every road could be mined. Every face could be hostile. Every checkpoint was a risk. To succeed, the operators had to do what they did best: blend in, disappear, and gather intelligence without drawing attention. Teams arrived quietly, slipping into the country under the cover of humanitarian operations or intelligence liaisons. Civilian clothing replaced uniforms. Vehicles carried no markings. Weapons were stripped of serial numbers. The early phase of Amber Star was all about surveillance and patience. Operators mapped safe houses, monitored vehicle movements, and built detailed profiles of their targets. Where they slept, who they trusted, the times they traveled, every detail mattered. One operator later described the process simply: you start with a name, then you build a shadow, a life map. You learn when they eat, where they sleep, who they call, what roads they take. Once you know their shadow, you can step into it. Everything about Amber Star was designed for precision. Missions were rehearsed endlessly. Scale models of towns were built on tables inside safe houses. Routes were driven at night until operators could navigate them without a single map. The secrecy was absolute. If a mission failed, there would be no public acknowledgement, no rescue. Operators carried cover stories for every contingency. If captured, they were just aid workers in the wrong place at the wrong time. One mission during Amber Star perfectly captured the operation's character. A tip from a local contact suggested that a mid-level war criminal, a commander involved in the operation of detention camps, was hiding in an apartment building in Vlasenica. The team moved quickly. They rehearsed every detail of the approach, down to recognizing Cyrillic signs in the dark. At 3 a.m., they drove into the town and parked a car equipped with a hidden camera across from the target building. For days, the car sat motionless. The operators rotated shifts, monitoring every movement, every visitor. By the end of the week, they had a complete picture times, associates, patterns that would lead to the man's eventual arrest months later. The primary targets, Karadzic and Mladic, were another challenge entirely. Both men had layers of protection, loyal guards, heavily armed bodyguards, and a network of informants that warned them of NATO movements. Karadzic frequently changed moving between mountain villages and underground bunkers. Mladic rarely traveled without an escort of armed soldiers. Delta and SAS teams tracked them relentlessly, often getting within striking distance, but unable to act without risking a political catastrophe. The missions became a long game of patience and pressure, a test of endurance, where every mistake could cost lives or spark international outrage. Amber Star laid the groundwork for many of the successful high-value target operations in the years that followed. The intelligence gathered in Bosnia helped NATO shape its air campaign in 1995, allowing precision strikes on key positions and supply lines. It also paved the way for the eventual arrests of Karadzic in 2008 and Mladic in 2011, long after the war had ended, but undeniably rooted in the networks and groundwork laid during these early operations. For the operators, it was never about credit. It was about the mission, quiet professionals doing quiet work, knowing the world would never hear the full story. In Bosnia, not every mission was a firefight. Sometimes the most important victories came from silence, from patience, from invisibility. In the small eastern Bosnian town of Vlasenica, a surveillance mission would show exactly how precision and discipline defined Delta Force during the war. It began with a whisper. A local informant, trusted but cautious, told NATO intelligence of a mid-level war criminal hiding in plain sight. He was a man responsible for some of the worst atrocities during the early stages of the conflict, running detention camps where prisoners were beaten, tortured, and killed. The tip was clear. He was living quietly in an apartment complex on the edge of town. He blended in with the locals, moving only when necessary, rarely staying in one place for too long. For Delta, this wasn't just another lead. It was a chance to gather undeniable evidence, the kind of proof that could tie him to orders, movements, and associates. Planning began immediately. In a dimly lit safe house several towns away, operators spread a map of Vlasenica across a battered wooden table. Every street was marked, every alley was noted. They studied building layouts, traffic patterns, and escape routes. Then came the rehearsals. Using scale models of the target area, they practiced over and over again approach angles, parking positions, camera placements. They memorized the Cyrillic street signs to avoid hesitation. They timed every step of the insertion down to the second until the entire plan could be executed in complete silence. This wasn't just preparation, it was precision, the kind of precision that kept missions invisible. The night of the operation was quiet. At 0300 hours, 2 unmarked vehicles rolled into Vlasenica. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of light from a distant window. The operators wore civilian clothes, worn jackets, local boots, nondescript hats, nothing to draw attention. They parked a modified sedan along the street opposite the target building, a seemingly ordinary car with a state-of-the-art camera system hidden behind the grille and along the dashboard. The engine shut off. The town returned to silence. The first shift began before sunrise. From inside the car, the operators blended into the quiet rhythm of the town. The camera rolled, its lens steady and unblinking, capturing every movement in and out of the building. They watched without being seen. Locals walking to early morning markets, children playing in the distance, and most importantly, their target emerging only briefly, glancing down the street, then slipping into an unmarked vehicle,
before vanishing into the maze of narrow roads. For days, the car never moved. Operators rotated shifts, sleeping in the safe house during the day and returning at night. Every action was logged. Every vehicle license plate was noted. Every associate was photographed discreetly and filed into the growing intelligence package. Operating in Vlasenica wasn't just dangerous, it was suffocating. This was deep inside hostile territory. The wrong face seen at the wrong time, a question asked with the wrong accent, or an engine started at the wrong hour could have blown the mission. Operators learned to move like ghosts. They spoke quietly, avoided eye contact, and adapted to local patterns. Even buying food was a calculated risk. One operator would walk into a market, pick up basic items, pay in local currency, and leave without a word. Every action had to be rehearsed, every detail perfect, because the cost of failure was death or capture, and neither option came with backup or acknowledgement. After a week of round-the-clock surveillance, they had everything they needed. Precise movement patterns, timelines, photographic evidence of meetings with known associates, confirmation that their target was still active in coordinating small militia networks. The intel package was transmitted through secure channels, analyzed, and archived. Months later, it would form the backbone of a quiet surgical capture mission, another operation the world would never hear about. By 1995, Bosnia was no longer just a chaotic war zone. The front lines had hardened, NATO air power was reshaping the battlefield, and the men in the shadows had settled into a deadly rhythm. These were the missions no one spoke about. Missions that would never appear in press briefings or news reports, but would quietly shape the course of the war. For Delta Force, the focus was simple: find the people pulling the strings, understand their networks, and when the time was right, move in silence to remove them from the board. In the hills and towns of eastern Bosnia, the hunt for Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic became an obsession. These men were not just politicians and generals, they were symbols of the war itself. Every rumor, every tip from a frightened villager, every intercepted call was a thread to be pulled. Karadzic moved constantly, slipping between mountain villages, never staying long enough to leave a pattern. Mladic traveled under the watchful eyes of heavily armed escorts, his convoys unpredictable and aggressive. Getting close meant weeks of observation, blending into the background, memorizing the rhythms of roads and villages, and waiting for an opening that never seemed to come. Elsewhere, the missions shifted from surveillance to action. As NATO intensified its air campaign, accuracy became the difference between success and disaster. Delta operators, often alongside their British SAS counterparts, slipped behind enemy lines with laser designators packed in weathered rucksacks. Under moonless skies, they crept through forests and hills, silent and invisible, marking targets so high above that the operators could only hear the distant roar of jets before the earth shook. Each strike landed with surgical precision, artillery sites erased, ammunition depots obliterated, and command posts reduced to smoking craters. It was quiet, efficient, and deadly. Not every mission ended with fire from the sky. Many ended with silence. Delta and SAS teams specialized in surgical extractions, slipping into hostile towns in the dead of night to apprehend war criminals and high-value figures. These operations were as tense as they were methodical. Teams waited in safe houses for the moment when the target was isolated, then moved with speed and precision. No gunfire, no noise, only the soft thud of boots on concrete and the hum of engines fading into the darkness. By sunrise, the target would be gone, on a discreet flight out of the country, their names soon to appear on an indictment in The Hague. Every mission was built on trust and information. Intelligence networks stretched across Bosnia, linking Delta, the CIA, and allied units like the SAS and SBS. In one case, an SAS reconnaissance team fed real-time surveillance to a Delta unit moving through hostile ground, guiding them away from patrols and into a vantage point that gave NATO an edge in the next round of air operations. Cooperation was rarely perfect, but in Bosnia, it became essential. It was never without risk. Roads were unpredictable, lined with mines or controlled by militias whose loyalty shifted with the wind. One checkpoint could mean a polite wave through, the next could turn into an armed standoff. Operators carried local clothes, rehearsed cover stories, and knew enough of the language to bluff their way through tense encounters. Every movement was calculated, every decision weighed against the possibility of disaster. For those in the shadows, Bosnia was a quiet, grinding war. It was weeks of waiting, hours of surveillance, and minutes of action that had to be flawless. It was moving unseen, sleeping in strange beds, eating cold meals, and carrying the weight of missions that could never be acknowledged. But their work mattered. Every arrest disrupted command structures. Every confirmed target tightened NATO's grip on the battlefield. Every clean strike sent a message that nowhere was safe. Their success helped shape the environment that led to the Dayton Accords, proving that intelligence-driven precision could end a brutal conflict without the need for massive ground combat. And when the missions were over, there were no parades, no headlines, no medals, just quiet exfiltration, a return to the safe house, and the steady hum of the radio as the next assignment came in. In Bosnia, Delta Force was never alone. This war was not fought by one nation, one flag, or one unit. It was a coalition stitched together from the most elite forces the West could offer. British SAS Special Boat Service, French commandos, even the CIA's paramilitary teams, blending seamlessly into the shadows. Each unit brought something different. The SAS were masters of long-range reconnaissance, able to disappear into the hills for weeks at a time, gathering intelligence no satellite could provide. The SBS specialized in covert mobility, slipping along rivers, across lakes, or through hostile terrain, where quiet insertion meant survival. And the CIA's Special Activities Division provided a bridge between intelligence and action, feeding real-time human sources into missions that demanded split-second decisions. From the outside, it looked like chaos, different nations, different chains of command, different rules of engagement. But inside the wire, in those quiet operations rooms scattered across Sarajevo and Tuzla, there was only the mission. Operators learned quickly that trust was their greatest asset. Information flowed in the simplest terms, no ego, no politics. A surveillance report from an SAS patrol would be in the hands of a Delta team within hours. A confirmed high-value target from a French recon team could mean a surgical NATO strike that same night. And on the ground, the cooperation ran even deeper. Mixed teams, Americans, Brits, and occasionally French operators ran side by side on surveillance and capture missions. They shared safe houses, weapons, and risk. Language barriers broke down quickly when the stakes were survival. In the mountains east of Srebrenica, SAS teams operated deep behind enemy lines, feeding intelligence on troop movements and artillery positions. Delta operators used that information to guide precision strikes that silenced guns aimed at civilian enclaves. In return, Delta provided overwatch during extractions, covering their allies as they slipped back across hostile terrain to safe zones. But this kind of cooperation didn't come without friction. Different nations had different rules, where one team was authorized to engage, another was under strict orders to observe and report. The tension between action and restraint was constant. Yet in the field, professional respect kept operations sharp and missions alive. In one town near Rogatica, an SAS reconnaissance patrol coordinated with a Delta ground team moving through militia-controlled territory. The British provided real-time updates through encrypted comms, directing the Americans around checkpoints and ambush points. The result was a clean insertion, no contact, and the successful setup of surveillance equipment that would later help guide NATO strikes. This was the reality of special operations in Bosnia, an invisible network of professionals, each with a specific skill set, each willing to trust the other when the mission demanded it. And it worked. Every precise strike, every clean capture, every whisper of movement that reached a command center started with this cooperation. No one unit could have managed the scale and complexity of Bosnia alone. Together, they created a silent web across the country, mapping it, reading it, and shaping it from the shadows. It wasn't glamorous. There were no headlines, no credit, no public acknowledgement, When a mission succeeded, it was filed away in classified reports. When it failed, there were no names attached. But in those quiet months leading to Dayton, when NATO began to control the tempo of the war, it was this cooperation that made the difference. And when it was over, the teams packed up and disappeared. The SAS went home to Hereford. The Delta operators rotated out to other theaters. The SBS faded into the next mission. Bosnia went quiet, but the lessons of that silent partnership would echo for decades in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in every shadow war that followed. For those who were there, it wasn't about nations or politics. It was about the man next to you, the mission in front of you, and the quiet understanding that in the darkest corners of Bosnia, survival depended on trust. In Bosnia, the truth was never simple. Every operation, every movement, every whisper of action was buried under layers of secrecy. The men in the field moved like ghosts, and those at the top worked just as hard to keep it that way. Officially, there were no Delta Force teams in Bosnia, no SAS patrols slipping through the mountains, no CIA operatives recruiting sources in dimly lit cafes. What the world saw was a humanitarian mission, peacekeepers in blue helmets, and carefully worded statements about stability and security. But behind that polite facade, another war was being fought. Secrecy wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. The politics of the conflict were volatile. Every NATO country had its own interests, its own red lines. A single confirmed firefight involving foreign special operations forces could have escalated tensions with Serbia, drawn Russia deeper into the conflict, and shattered fragile diplomatic negotiations. So the missions stayed in the dark. Reports were classified. After-action details were buried in encrypted transmissions and locked files. Even among Allied units, information was shared sparingly, parceled out only to those who needed to know. In the towns and villages of Bosnia, rumors spread quietly. Locals spoke of strangers who appeared in the night, of quiet men who asked questions and vanished before sunrise, of sudden arrests where no one saw the shooters. To many, these stories sounded like myths, the war creating its own legends. But those who understood the quiet precision of modern special operations knew better. For the operators, secrecy was more than an order, it was survival. There was no glory in what they did, no public recognition waiting at home. They worked under the unspoken agreement that if something went wrong, no one would come for them. No one would admit they were even there. They carried out missions knowing that capture meant silence, that death meant disappearance, and the denials never stopped. Even years later, officials spoke in vague terms: liaison officers, observers, training teams. The men on the ground knew the truth, but they didn't need to talk. Quiet professionals do not seek headlines. This silence was part of the mission. The less attention drawn to their presence, the easier it was to operate, to gather intelligence, to disappear into the chaos of a country at war. Every layer of denial bought them more time, more freedom to work. But secrecy came with its own weight. Missions blurred together, successes and failures alike locked away, their stories known only to those who had been there. Some operators spoke later in careful interviews and memoirs, never naming names, never revealing more than they had to. Most said nothing at all. In Bosnia, the shadows were deliberate. They were built and maintained, a shield for the operators and a tool for the politicians. And as the war dragged on, that silence became its own language, one understood by everyone who lived and fought in those hills. The quiet was absolute, and in that quiet, history was written by men the world would never see. For years, the story of Bosnia's shadow war stayed buried. The missions, the arrests, the quiet operations that never made the evening news, all locked away in reports, stamped classified and sealed in vaults. But secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks. It started small. A line in a NATO briefing that didn't quite match the official story. A passing reference in a journalist's dispatch from Sarajevo. Whispers among aid workers about strangers in civilian clothes moving through checkpoints without questions. disappearing into the night. Then came the fragment stories told in quiet corners by those who had been close enough to see but not close enough to understand. Villagers speaking of men who set up strange equipment in the hills, then vanished before sunrise. A farmer recalling the hum of helicopters in the dead of night. No lights, no markings. A cafe owner in Pale remembering two quiet foreigners who asked questions and left without finishing their coffee. Over time, the puzzle pieces began to form a picture. When NATO's air campaign intensified in 1995, journalists noticed the uncanny precision of the strikes. Artillery positions hidden under camouflage netting, bunkers buried in forests, command posts built inside abandoned factories, all obliterated with surgical accuracy. Someone, somewhere, was providing the coordinates. And then, years later, came the admissions. Quiet, careful acknowledgments from retired operators and military officials. They never gave dates, they never named names, but they confirmed what had long been suspected, that Delta Force, the SAS, and other allied units had been on the ground, running missions so precise and so secret that even other NATO units didn't know they were there. Some accounts describe the long nights of surveillance, weeks of watching a single house in a hostile village, waiting for the right moment. Others spoke of the quiet arrests high-value figures taken in the middle of the night, driven across borders and handed over for trial. One former operator, speaking years after the war, said it simply, "It was never about glory, it was about control. Get in, get it done, and get out before anyone knew you were there." Even with these glimpses, most of the truth remains hidden. Entire operations are still classified, their details redacted or erased. The only evidence lies in scattered documents, blurred photos, and the memories of the men who lived in the shadows. For historians and researchers, Bosnia remains a mystery, a war where the official story is only half the story. The rest exists in the silence, in the spaces between what is known and what is still locked away. What has slipped into public knowledge is enough to sketch the outline. The surveillance, the reconnaissance, the precision strikes, and the surgical arrests that shape the battlefield without ever drawing attention. But the full picture, the exact missions, the risks taken, the nights that turned into firefights will remain hidden for years, perhaps forever. For the men who were there, that's how it's supposed to be. Quiet professionals do not seek headlines. They move through history without leaving footprints, their victories written in classified reports and unmarked by the winter of 1995. The war was running out of time. The world saw the headlines, Srebrenica, Sarajevo, Tuzla, but what it didn't see were the quiet hands moving in the shadows, tightening their grip on the conflict. Months of relentless NATO air campaigns had crippled the Bosnian Serb military. Command posts were gone, fuel depots destroyed, and artillery positions silenced one by one. But the airstrikes alone didn't turn the tide. They worked because someone on the ground was there to make sure they counted. Delta Force, the SAS, and their allies provided the intelligence that satellites couldn't. They moved unseen through hostile towns and mountain roads, finding the targets, mapping the routes, and guiding the precision that allowed NATO to strike hard without hitting civilians. The results were undeniable. The siege of Sarajevo, which had strangled the city for nearly 4 years, began to loosen. Shelling that had echoed through the valley every day grew quieter, then stopped. In villages across Bosnia, militia checkpoints disappeared overnight. The war machine that had fueled years of chaos was suddenly fractured, and its commanders were running out of options. Then came Dayton. The peace talks in Ohio were tense, fragile, and full of mistrust, but behind the scenes, the pressure was real, a constant reminder to every side that NATO knew where they were, what they were moving, and what they had left. The shadow war on the ground had reshaped the battlefield long before the diplomats shook hands. When the accords were finally signed in December 1995, there was no victory parade for the men in the shadows. They packed their gear, burned documents, erased tracks from safe houses and forward bases, and disappeared as quietly as they had arrived. For them, Bosnia wasn't about recognition, it was about control. about bringing a brutal war to a quiet end. For the people of Bosnia, the guns had finally gone silent. In the streets of Sarajevo, markets reopened. Children played soccer where shells had fallen. In the countryside, farmers returned to their fields, cautious but grateful for the quiet that had returned. It was not peace in the purest sense, the scars ran too deep for that, but it was the closest thing to it in years. Bosnia became more than just a mission. It became a lesson. That precision, patience, and intelligence could change the course of a war without massive ground invasions. That small teams, operating in the shadows, could create the leverage needed to end a conflict that had seemed endless. And then, as they had done so many times before, the quiet professionals faded into the next fight, leaving only silence and the knowledge that, for a moment, their work had brought a war to its knees.